Hi, my name is Katarina Sullivan and I would like to welcome you to my YouTube channel. I'm so excited because today is the last day that we're going to be talking about Senate voting, which, as you have seen from the past two videos, is a bit of a nightmare. This is the third video in this little Senate series we've done. So the first video we talked about how to fill out the Senate voting paper. The second video we spoke about how the votes are counted. And this video we're going to talk about the changes that were made last election in 2016 and how they will impact this election. So in the previous videos we've spoken about above the line and below the line voting. Now, I went ahead and gave my personal recommendation to vote below the line because you can control your preferences a lot more closely than you can with above the line voting. But back in 2013, you had even less control over your preferences when it came to above the line voting. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, why the changes were made and what we should see differently this election. So I'm going to start by taking you back to 1984. And this isn't an Orwellian reference, this is literally the year 1984. But the book 1984 could be closely linked to what we're talking about today. Anyway, in 1984, group ticket voting was introduced. And this was introduced to reduce the amount of informal votes when voting for the Senate. What was happening was that there were a lot of people filling out the Senate ballot paper incorrectly, which meant those votes were being counted as informal votes and not actually being used in the voting process. So in order to reduce the amount of informal votes, this group ticketing was introduced. And basically, up until the federal election in 2016, you could fill out a ballot paper and for above the line voting, just go ahead and put 1 in the Senate box of the party that you wanted to see in. What group ticket voting meant was that for above the line voting, instead of having to fill out 6 boxes, you could just fill out 1 box. So for example, we use the Citrus Party, you could just go ahead and put 1 in the box for Citrus Party for above the line voting, and that was you, done. Fold up the paper in the ballot box. What ended up happening over time was that a lot more of the minor parties and independent candidates were getting voted into the Senate because they had done what are called preference deals with the major parties. Now, we have 2 major parties in Australia, the Coalition made up of the Liberals and Nationals and the Labor Party. The Coalition is currently in government and the Labor Party is currently in opposition. What was happening between the 2 parties was they didn't want each other to get in because they're each other's biggest rivals. So they were putting each other absolutely last on the preference list. When you were voting 1 for either party, you were voting last for the other party. And they were prioritizing some of the smaller independent parties without people actually realizing what the preferences were. In the instance that we were using with the Citrus Party could have been number 1, but then they could be saying, right, well, we actually like the Marrow Party and we're going to put them as number 2. But as I said before, I'm not a big fan of marrow vegetables and I didn't want them to be number 2. But if I voted 1 Citrus Party in this old group ticket voting system, I'd actually be voting marrows number 2. In 2016, they decided there's too many minor parties in the Senate that we're not actually sure if they've got the right amount of votes. So before the 2016 election, the whole voting system changed and that was passed in Parliament. And so now we have a little bit more control over our preferences in above the line voting. Because as we talked about the last 2 videos, you can actually fill out 6 boxes for above the line voting. Not even can fill out. You have to fill out a minimum of 6 boxes for above the line voting. You can fill out more. So these preference deals between parties still exist, but they're a lot more transparent. So you might have heard in the past couple of weeks about United Australia Party and their preference deals, and Clive Palmer having meetings with Scott Morrison, who's our current Prime Minister and the current leader of the Coalition, as well as Bill Shorten, who's our current opposition leader and the current leader of the Labor Party. So what those preference deals mean for this election and in the election in 2016, since the changes to Senate voting have been made, is that Clive Palmer is deciding, for instance, and of course all parties will have to make this same decision, but Clive Palmer is deciding whether or not he's going to put Labour or Liberal as his second preference on his how to vote card for the Senate for the United Australia Party. And what voters hope from those preference deals is that those deals indicate if the senator from the minor party does get elected, what does that mean for what they do in the Senate? Are they going to side more with the coalition or more with Labour? The Senate is just a crazy mess of a chamber. Like, you never know what's going to happen in the Senate. And because there are so many minor parties and what we call crossbenchers, so people that can cross the floor either way with the coalition or Labour, and because there are so many of those, you never know what's really going to happen. And a lot of the time, senators can change their mind for some of those minor parties. So the preference deals do not 100% guarantee that because United Australia Party might put the coalition as their second preference, it doesn't mean that they're going to side with the coalition once the Senate starts sitting for the 46th Parliament of Australia. Now, why am I using the example of the United Australia Party? Well, at the moment, they're sort of the biggest contenders for some of those Queensland seats. Every election, we talk about the election really being focused in a certain state or territory. Which states or territories have the most marginal seats, so which ones are the most likely to go either way in the House of Representatives, and which state and territories have shown in the polls leading up to the election that they might end up going a different way to either of the major parties. Because of course, this year the election is looking really close. The polls are indicating that Labour is in the lead and that Shorten will probably become our next Prime Minister. However, there are so many seats across the country which could be picked up by the coalition through these preference deals on these how to vote cards. So we don't really know what's going to happen. So if you do go to a polling place and you get given a how to vote card by a minor party, the preference deals will be who they've put as their second, third, fourth preferences on the how to vote card to show you who you should be supporting after them. And preference deals do tend to shape how the Parliament will work together for the next 3 years. And for senators, some of them for the next 6 years. Last election in 2016, we had what is known as a double dissolution election. So the entire of the Senate was dismissed. And this is abnormal. Usually we have what's called a half Senate election, and that's the regular way that we do our voting. Senator terms are 6 years for states and 3 years for territories. Every alternate 3 years, so over a 6-year span, 6 seats will become available, and every alternate 3 years, another 6 seats become available. Except for the territories, because they get elected every single election, because their term is only for 3 years. At the last election, there were probably more minor parties that were elected because all 12 seats per state were up for re-election. This means that there were senators who were elected into Parliament who didn't actually reach the quota. Now, the quota is what we spoke about last time. It's that ridiculous mathematical equation that is basically the total number of formal votes for a state or territory divided by the number of senators to be elected plus 1, so that will either be 7 or 3, rounded down plus 1. And whatever that number is the minimum required to be immediately voted into the Senate. And from there, we then take the candidates who have got across that quota line, count their total number of votes, work out a transfer value, which is all done in my last video, and transfer their second preference votes at a reduced rate, which is equal to the transfer value rate. And then that process keeps happening and happening. So I did briefly touch on this last time, but there are senators who are in Parliament at the moment. Their term expires on the 30th of June 2019, one senator in particular who actually has been elected to parliament with only 19 first preference votes. Now, I do have to admit there was a little bit of dumb luck in this. So what happened was that one senator got elected based on 77 first preference votes, and that was done through the preferential voting process that I just spoke about. So he got elected with 77 votes and then found out that he was actually a dual citizen and had to resign from his position in parliament, which then meant that for his party, the next senator was put in. And the next senator from that party who was there to take his spot was a person who got 19 first preference votes. So we shouldn't be seeing too much like this at the next election, because there's only going to be 6 senators up for re-election, and the chances of the major parties getting in are a lot greater because there's only 6 spaces to fill, and most people around the country will default to the major parties. And even for the minor parties that do get elected, which we might see a little bit more of, especially up in Queensland with United Australia and One Nation, for those minor parties that do get in, their senators that get elected will probably have more first preference votes than less than 100. For a state of 3 million, let's remember, like less than 100 votes in a state of 3 million voters. This is why the reform will impact more this election, because there are only 6 spaces to fill, and we're not going to go so far down the line of the preferences when voting. We'll actually probably stay right up the top with those preferences for above the line and below the line on the voting paper. So again, this is why those preferences are so important. It's not just about your first preference, it's about your second, third, fourth, fifth, especially if your first preference is someone with a strong chance of getting in. So we're going to go back to my fruit and vegetable examples because I just love my fruit and vegetable examples. We had the citrus party, and I put 1 for grapefruit on my Senate voting paper. So let's say that the state or territory I'm voting in has 1 million people, just a nice round number, and we've put grapefruit as 1. And let's say that grapefruit's really, really popular. Let's say they get 600,000 votes. And I'm pretty sure our quota from memory the other day was like 107,000, if I'm correct. I'm not going to be bothered to do the maths again. I've pulled my calculator away for the next like 20 years after doing the Senate videos. So if we say they got 600,000 votes, that's 400 and something thousand above the quota. That means their transfer value is going to be a lot higher. So whoever I put as second preference is going to have a higher transfer value. So your second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th preferences are really, really important when it comes to below the line voting. And your second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth preferences are really important when it comes to above the line voting. I hope this shed some light on what changes were made, how the changes were made, why the changes were made, and why we should expect to see a greater impact from the 2016 voting reform at the 2019 election. Next video, we're going to be talking about what it actually means when the votes are counted. Like, how do we choose who our next Prime Minister is based off this election, and what impact will it have for different parties in the Senate to get involved. So that's all next video. Super exciting stuff, which all of politics is exciting if you find the right way to make it relate to you. Please like this video, share it with your family and friends, subscribe to my channel, follow me on social media, all the links are below. Keep an eye out for upcoming videos because I'm going to be pumping them out leading up to the election. You're going to get sick of seeing my face and hearing my voice. I know I am every single day. But until next time, stay as awesome as you are and keep researching your candidates for the upcoming election.